You're listening to the Outdoors Channel.
Who? What? Yeah!
Woo! I think it's a splendid idea.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station. Yes, the Outdoors Station. A new name which we've had to adopt due to legal reasons. Over the next few weeks, our website and content will be rebranded, ready for a fresh launch in 2007. You'll find us over at theoutdoorstation.co.uk very soon. So, don't worry, we haven't gone away, we're just rebranding, and we'll be back at full strength very soon. In the meantime, book club host Andy Howell has been holding it all together and been working away with some exciting new interviews. So, sit back and enjoy an interview all about the Emerald Isle with Paddy Dillon.
This time out on the book club, we're taking a look at Ireland, a country that offers magnificent mountain walking, superb coastal paths, and these days a coast-to-coast route as well. Yet for all that Ireland has to offer, it remains relatively underexplored by UK walkers and backpackers. This is something of a shame, because if you're not one safe for walking in the heat of a Mediterranean day, then Ireland might offer you an ideal walking holiday destination next summer. To help us understand more about what Ireland has to offer, I turn to Paddy Dillon, that chieftain of Irish walking guide writers. Welcome, Paddy.
How do you do?
Now, it's true, isn't it, that Ireland offers some fantastic walking. I mean, equally as good as much of Wales or Scotland, and yet it is relatively unknown by people here in the UK.
That's right. I think what happens when people are thinking of, say, going abroad is they're always looking towards the mainland European scene, and they're not looking the other way, where there's this odd little island just sitting there out in the sea. I've always said that Ireland has landforms which are pretty much on the same scale as England and Wales, but they're as rugged as Scotland. So it's a sort of a mixture, if you like. Everything you can think about that's good and bad about walking in England, Scotland and Wales, you'll find all that wrapped up in Ireland. The mountains are generally 2,000 to 3,000 foot, but very rugged underfoot, like climbing Munros once you actually set on them. It's something which wouldn't give British walkers any problem at all from that point of view. It's the sort of scenery they're used to. It's just completely different when you get there. A whole new scene, if you like.
No, I spent one summer walking there about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was fantastic walking, but it was probably the hardest walking holiday I've had, in the sense that it is very rugged, as you said. Now, you've got 3 guides at the moment, which give people some idea of the variety of walking there is in Ireland. There's a mountain walks guide, a coastal walks guide with looks like some wonderful coastal paths, and you've also created a coast-to-coast route, haven't you, which links together a number of long-distance walking paths from west to east, I think.
That's right. What I actually noticed over the years was that they started developing waymark trails. They started, I think, in 1980 with the Wicklow Way going southwards from Dublin. And then before you knew it, everybody was out there walking it. You can't really go wrong when you've got 1 million people living at the end of a path. Somebody's going to fall for it and make a run at it. And before you knew it, a bit of publicity in the local papers and the telly, and everybody was off walking the Wicklow Way. The only thing is, it's all over within a week, 5 or 6 days, that's all there was to it. But it became like a bandwagon thing. Every tourist group wanted their own waymarked way. So what started happening was people further down the path said, why don't we carry on? Why don't we have an extension to the Wicklow Way, but we'll call ours the South Leinster Way? And the next ones in line would say, yeah, we'll develop an East Munster Way. And way across country in places like Kerry, they were saying, yeah, we could have a Kerry Way. And in the end, the final link, if you like, was an enormous great trail right through County Cork called the Blackwater Way. And I was watching all this developing and thought, they're actually making a coast-to-coast walk, only nobody spotted it yet. So all I did was followed all the waymarks they'd hammered into the ground and said, hey, there we go, Irish coast-to-coast walk. And it's proved very popular. The reason I would know that is because right slap bang in the middle, in one of the most remote parts, a lady was thinking of doing farmhouse B&B. And I said, well, believe me, I said, nobody is going to walk past your door, because if they do, they've got to walk 26 miles that day. And if you do B&B, they can break that into 2 stretches of 13. I said, so you're ideally placed. And she's had people literally sleeping on the living room floor, all wrapped up in blankets and whatever bedding she can scrape together. I think she said only one person ever walked past the door, and that was a big burly Scotsman who said, 26 miles, no problem to me. So, yeah, it's proved very popular. And the funny thing is, there are plenty of people who just walk these trails individually, but there are obviously an awful lot of people who just the idea of walking coast to coast really appealed to them.
Okay, well, before we talk about the coastal paths and the mountain walks, let's have a look at the coast to coast route that you've created there. How long does it take from one end to the other?
Well, you're looking at a journey of 387 miles, the way these waymarks go. And there are a lot of loops in there, and no doubt people could look at the maps and say, oh, well, look, that's like, 3 ways round a square. I could go straight across, save a couple of miles here and there. You could get it down to, say, 350. But you're probably looking at being out for 3.5 weeks, something like that. I've broken the route down into 24 daily stages, and people can, pick and choose, chop and choose between them all. If they find a very long stretch, they can chop it into 2. If there's 2 shortish stretches together, they can join them up and have a long day's walk. But I think, most people are going to be out for 3 or 4 weeks really doing that. And it goes all the way from Dublin through the Wicklow Mountains, across the Blackstairs Mountains, a little stretch alongside the rivers Barrow, Suir and Nore, and then gets into the Comera Mountains, Knockmeal Down Mountains. Great big long walk through County Cork, and then switching over, and the last little stretch along the Kerry Way literally goes right along the foot of Ireland's highest mountain, Carrantoul, and at that point you're actually looking towards the Atlantic coast and finish out on Valentia Island at a little promontory called Bray Head. So that basically is the route. Almost entirely waymarked. I think there's a stretch of about 10 to 12 miles which isn't, but that's all. Everything else is waymarked, properly signposted, and has all been upgraded in recent years, so it's quite good to follow.
So good navigation there,
yeah.
In your guide, the book's broken down into lengths of about how long?
Well, I generally reckon it's going to turn out, you're going to be walking about 15 miles a day on average, something like that. And a lot of that is going to be on reasonably hard surfaces. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some very open, wild and boggy stretches in the Irish mountains, but the route is not particularly a mountain walk. The waymark routes tend to be following very quiet roads, forest tracks, farm tracks, what they call bog roads, the roads that people make up the mountains to cut the turf. And by linking these together, they then have some areas of open moorland where you follow the waymark post from, say, the end of one bog road to another. So most of it's fairly hard surface walking. It's the sort of walking people can do fairly quickly. So 15 miles a day doesn't mean, the climbing mountains 15 miles a day. A lot of it is actually following tracks. But the thing is, it does go to the little towns, the villages, so you get all that sort of Irish history and heritage and everything else built into the route, quite on top of the wildlife that you would notice and the scenic splendour of the mountains as you're crossing them. What I did for people who just can't resist a challenge is every time the route goes around the foot of a mountain, I offer an alternative route going over the mountains. Some of those are particularly rugged, but I've put them all in as like little appendices. If anybody really can't resist a challenge, or if they want to include Ireland's highest mountain towards the end, all that information is there.
Yes, and one of the great things about walking in Ireland is that you've got you're never that far from a village, but they're small and it's and sparsely populated, isn't it? It's very rarely do you feel that you're getting close to any kind of metropolis.
No, the only big towns on the route would be places like Clonmel and Fermoy. And apart from that, the little villages are little, and everybody thinks that, if they turn up in a little Irish village, there'll be loads of pubs. Some of them don't have anything like that. They really are just places where people live. There are actually very few pubs actually on the route, and so what you find in some places is you can be going very close to a village, and it's almost inevitable that you're going to want to make the detour just to go into town, maybe for a night's lodging, the pub, the shop, whatever, but just to make sure people know exactly what they're getting on the coast-to-coast route. I've included details of facilities along the way, so people can spot, say, when there's a big long stretch coming up with absolutely nothing. And there are some parts of County Cork traversed by the Blackwater Way where you have no shops, no pubs and no lodgings, and so you need to know what's actually near the route. And sometimes near the route can mean 4 or 5 miles away, in which case you want to know about what bus services cross the route as well to get you there and back. So I've included a lot of that, but believe me, at the end of the day, when you actually get into a little Irish village and the pub is there and you walk into it, people are sort of first they're surprised to see you because regardless of the popularity of the route, they still seem to be surprised when somebody from far-flung parts of the world actually beats a track to their little village and turns up at their little pub, stands at the bar and asks for a drink, so they want to know all about you, what you're at, where you're going next, and for a lot of them, because they don't walk themselves, the entire notion of the route is basically a complete mystery to them. They have no reason why you're doing it, where you're going or anything, but they're all the same. They're pleased to have a chat with you while you're there, and then we'll scratch their heads mystified when you walk out the door.
Yes, it's not a place that has a great history of hill walking. Certainly not, as I say, a very popular sport. But anybody that's listening into that who's just a bit worried, I mean, certainly the guide is very comprehensive, isn't it, about how you get into towns and where you can find accommodation. And this is largely a B&B route. It's not one where you'd be carrying a tent on your back.
Yeah, I've carried a tent all the way across Ireland, but the number of campsites is you could count them on the fingers of one hand in an entire 3 or 4 weeks out. They're not really that big into camping. It's almost always indoor accommodation. So what I've done is I've included the sort of B&B and hostel and independent hostel list at the back. All these places are within easy reach of the route. And I cannot think if I've included as many as 3 or 4 campsites in there. There really aren't that many. However, having said that, if you do carry a tent, you will find places to pitch it, and that could be just on the wild slopes of the mountain. It is actually forbidden to camp in state forests, but when you walk through them, you can tell there are places where people have camped. And I know some people, are quite happy to sort of just camp in any old little corner. You will find as well that, say it's coming on in the evening and you're approaching a farm or even a B&B with a big lawn in the front, it's surprising how many people will let you have a pitch for the night. But it isn't really camping country. It's very much B&B hostel based, and that's just the way it is in Ireland. They're not big into hill walking, and they're not that big into camping at all, really. So you take that, as one of the things about the country, build it into your plans, and make all your own arrangements accordingly.
So it sounds to me like it's a kind of almost quintessential Irish walking experience. It's long days. You can go high if you want, but you don't have to go high. And then you've always got that wonderful Irish welcome somewhere at the end of the day, even if you have to take the bus to get it. So that's that book is it's called The Coast to Coast Path, and it's published by Cicerone. That's right, yeah? That's
right, yeah.
Okay, and it's a 387-mile route that's broken down into 24-day stages, it says on the Cicerone website. So those of you looking for a new kind of long-distance walking experience that perhaps isn't so wild, then the coast-to-coast walk is certainly for you. Now, let's talk about the mountains, because there are a lot of mountains in Ireland.
There are. It surprised me exactly how many. When I first was talking to Cicerone about this guidebook, I was caught on the hop because I'd only just taken my very first manuscript to Cicerone, and even as I handed it over, the publisher at the time, Walt Unsworth, said to me, "So what are you doing for us next?" And believe me, the only thing I could think of off the top of my head was the mountains of Ireland. And it was only as the contract slid across the tabletop for me to sign, I realised that was it. I was going to have to climb them all, but first I was going to have to find out how many. And it surprised me that there were actually 200 mountains above 2,000 feet, and then another dozen or so which actually rise above 3,000 feet. So I certainly had my walking cut out for me there.
No, I guess Kerry and the Ringo Kerry is the most well-known of the mountain walking areas. But can you give us some idea of some of the others? Because I found them very challenging, very rugged, and I mean, access is a bit of a struggle sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah. I think what you find is you get places like Dublin with the Wicklow Mountains virtually on the doorstep, and they get very, very well used. But they're also covered in very thick deposits of peat. So when people go out and use them with a vengeance, all the paths become very, very boggy. And then you get places like, say, down in Kerry or in the middle of the country in the Galtee Mountains, where there aren't that many people and the ground is much, much harder, less boggy, more rocky. And you find that some of the ridges even, they get so few people up them that they don't actually take a decent trodden path. So whereas you might get, say, a very popular route like the Devil's Ladder of Carntool, you don't necessarily get that many other very well-trodden approaches, although as the years have gone by, even the faint paths become more defined. But there are plenty of mountains. I'd say, three-quarters of the mountains, you'd be struggling to find any sort of trodden path on them. And so when you go out there, your navigation has to be spot on. And also, because you're not going to get little signposts that say public footpath, public bridleway, you don't get any signposts like that whatsoever. You need to figure out how you're going to get onto those mountains. Now, what I've done through blood, sweat and tears is find ways up and down those mountains and pop them in a guidebook. But some of my ploys, if you like, for finding access routes onto hills would include so you never actually start grappling with farmland because there are so many blackthorn hedges, gorse bushes, big barbed wire fences, and such awkward terrain, if you like, between the road and the hill. It's not worth bothering with. Mind you, if you follow the road further uphill, you'll suddenly find out there are no walls, no fences, it's just open country, and you can just leave the road and walk straight up the hill, never crossing a wall or a fence or anything. So that's one trick, if you like, a trick of the trade to get up the mountains. The other one would be to spot the link between, say, the road and the open hill, and that's often, say, a state forest, where there are going to be tracks that will get you from one end of the forest to the other, and with a bit of luck, they'll just pop you out onto the hillside. Apart from that, a guidebook is going to let you in on all the ins and outs, if you like, because someone else has been there and suffered before you and figured out where to get up the hill. Going round the country, the strange thing is all the mountains are fairly near the coast in Ireland. The middle of Ireland is, more or less just rolling, drumming country with lots of lakes in it. The big mountain ranges are all round the edge. So if you work round, say, clockwise from Dublin, you'll find the Wicklow Mountains, the Galtee Mountains, the Comoras and Knockmeal Downs all in a group. All the big mountain ranges down in the southwest, and then going up the west coast, mountain ranges around Galway, Connemara, Mayo, and then again up in the far northwest with the big mountain ranges in Donegal, the Sperrin Mountains in Northern Ireland, and the mountains of Mourne again very close to the coast, and that will bring you back in a circle back to Dublin. So everything is round the edge. So all your travelling is going to be literally all four corners of Ireland while you go chasing up and down the mountains. But it really is, it's just amazing how remarkably different each mountain range is. Some of them you will be literally up to your waist in bog at times, and others it will be the hardest rock you've ever come across, some of the sharpest ridges, and some of the most amazing tiny little summits, if you like, and then compare them to, say, the previous one you were on, which was just a great broad bogland. So everything is just a case of variety and plenty of it.
This case of the mountains being very close to the sea makes it a kind of very wonderful walking experience, I found, because you are clambering high, and it's hard walking because you're never far from that peat bog, and but then you often drop down into the most wonderful estuaries and stretches of coastal paths with not a soul for miles around. It really is fabulous walking, a bit reminiscent of the northwest of Scotland, I think, in many ways, but it's like that every day, isn't it?
That's right. I think the entire western seaboard, if you go all the way from the southwest to the northwest, there are so many indentations in that coast, big, long inlets with mountains piled up between each one, that every mountain you climb, almost, if you get the clear spell, includes a view of the sea. And because the sea is cutting in so close to the base of the mountains, often enough you're going to climb the full height of these mountains. There's going to be very few opportunities to climb them from a high pass. You're going to be climbing them from somewhere not far above sea level. So you're going to measure every foot of the hill on the way up and coming down the other side, and that really does make for some very, very challenging walking. But it's just all part of the variety. It just is so amazingly varied, and people don't realise that. You know, they think if they've seen one big boggy hill, they're all going to be big boggy hills. They're not. They're just incredibly varied. As you work your way around the countryside, all the regional changes you get as you go from towns and villages as well. Even the accent changes. Everything changes, and you know it's all part of the experience. But certainly to go all the way around those mountains, I was amazed when I set off. I thought I would never see the back of them, but when I added up all my days together, it took me exactly 12 weeks to climb them all. It's not bad for 200 and odd mountains, but some of the travel in between one range and the other was quite a long way, really. And then once you got into the next range, everything would suddenly become a case of chasing up 3-4 mountains in a day down the other side, and then the next morning up and climb 3, 4 or 5 more down again, and it really was quite a challenge to actually get round them all. But like I said, it can be done in 12 weeks. I'm sure some super fit people could do them in a month. But, you know, I was just sort of roughing it, slugging it, hitchhiking from one range to another, and then just climbing mountains until there were none left to climb. So that was my plan.
Now, one of the things I like about the guide is you give very extensive details about how you got from one range to another, because I found that for a 2-week holiday walking the mountains, you're walking in one place for a couple of days and then moving on somewhere else. Now, I did it by hiring a car and moving from place to place, but certainly in your guide you give pretty comprehensive notes as to how you moved from range to range, all by public transport.
Yeah, that's right. I'd either catch the bus. The trains I find don't really get near the mountains. They get to 1 or 2 handy centres. Bus Erin does actually have quite a good network of buses, and up in the north, Ulster bus services get into every single little remote area that you can think of. And if I couldn't do it by bus, I'd just hitchhike. So one way or the other, I got round everything. And all I ever want to do when I'm out travelling is just to get to the end of the road where I can start climbing my hill. And that's what I did day after day after day. And in some cases, I actually stayed up on the hills as well. And if I wasn't actually camping, I was just making a rough bivvy, just throw the sleeping bag down somewhere on a col and sleep out the night, and then be there first light in the morning up the next mountain. But I sort of thought when I'd finished the thing, because I'd done it in a sort of a fairly logical clockwork direction all the way around Ireland, I thought I might as well include those notes just to let people know how you can get from one place to another and keep the thing going. And so that was the idea for including those at the beginning of every section.
No, I think that's very helpful, because even if you're only there for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you're probably going to be moving on a number of occasions, and it's not always easy to find the starts of walks, particularly. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is really the mountains of Ireland are for those people who are experienced and enjoy mountain walking in Snowdonia or the lakes. As you said, navigation is quite important. You've got to know where you are, and certainly it can be hard going, can't it? Both hard rock and a lot of bog as well. But the other thing that I would suggest to anybody thinking seriously about doing the water is, for goodness sake, please take a guidebook with you, preferably Paddy's, because actually it's very difficult finding your first steps onto the hills. I thought when I was walking in the hills around Westport and Sligo that the area seemed to be inhabited by a band of farmers who, on their days off, just spent their time putting up barbed wire fences. It's quite difficult, isn't it? This isn't something to try and stumble on by just taking the map. For goodness sake, make use of Paddy's experience of being there first.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the barbed wire fences is the whole face of Ireland and Irish farming is changing, and it's changing because of all the European regulations. A lot of open country in Ireland was held in common by a number of farms, but to get all the headage premiums and things like that, you actually had to specify how much land you owned. And it was no good saying, oh, well, we own the mountain in common. In European legislation, you actually had to specify your acreage. So they had to get up there, mark everything out with barbed wire fencing, and say, well, I own this, and my neighbour owns that, and the one over the hill, he owns that. And then you get your payments. And that was the only way they could make money. So just to say, head and shoulders above water, they'd literally to go out there, fence off the whole of Ireland, and it happened over a period of, just a few years. It caused a lot of hassle because in fencing it off, it makes it very awkward if you're walking along a ridge to have to climb over a fence 3 or 4 times to be able to finish a day's walk. But that's what it was all about. If they didn't fence off their land and say that land now belongs to me, they would never have got the payments, and a lot of those marginal hill farms would have just vanished. But another strange thing happened in 1995. There was a law passed called the Occupiers Liability Act, and this was supposed to open up the countryside by allaying the fears of farmers who thought walkers might sue them if they went and gashed themselves on a barbed wire fence or fell down a hole or something. So everybody was in on this. They all said, oh, yeah, it'd be great to have this Occupiers Liability Act. So it's no fault of the farmer if the walker goes and twists his ankle on a hill. Seemed to make perfect sense. When the Act was passed in 1995, it actually had the opposite effect of virtually closing the country, because one of the things it said was that if anyone was there as a trespasser, then the occupier wasn't liable for them. But if you were invited onto the land, and that could include putting up a signpost saying walk this way, you were then liable for them. So what they said was no unauthorised access, big yellow signs everywhere. And the net effect was, again, closing down the countryside almost wholemeal. But walkers have got round it. They just sort of get on with the walking, and so long as nobody sees them, they're all right. But it's not an ideal situation. The access thing is half-cocked, half-baked, whatever. It's not great when it's actually down in black and white on paper. But the actual practicalities of it is, if you don't cause anyone any grief when you're out walking, nobody will cause you any grief back. But the way one farmer put it to me was, don't ever ask for permission, because the answer must always be no. Which I thought was wonderful. In other words, I could climb his hill so long as I didn't ask if I could climb his hill. He was quite happy for me to just walk up the hill, but he wasn't happy for me to ask permission to go up the hill. It seems bizarre to an outsider, but the way people in Ireland approach it is they just plan their walks, they get out and they do them. And occasionally, yes, there are, sort of stern words exchanged, if you like, between farmers and landowners, but it's usually because somebody's done something wrong at some point. So the other thing you need to be aware of is the access situation. There are no rights of way. There is no general right of access to mountains, but people climb them all the time anyway, and the farmers, by and large, let them.
Yeah, it takes you a while to get used to that, doesn't it? You find, I think in 2 weeks I didn't see one stile or fence crossing, but quite often, just as you were beginning to despair, you'd see somewhere where the barbed wire fence had been trampled down, obviously, and left there for quite a long time. And there is a bit of a rambling access movement, isn't there, in Ireland now?
Yeah, there is an organisation called Keep Ireland Open, which is striving to get the law amended in some fashion to actually, allow walkers to get out and have a decent day's walk. A lot of what they do is basically just plain old lobbying, but the farmers' lobbies are absolutely huge. Ireland is a farming country. Farming is much, much greater part of their economy than it is, say, in Britain, where it's actually quite tiny. We're an industrial nation. Ireland is a farming nation. So they've got to be able to farm. But when people want to get out onto the hill, obviously they're shouting with very, very tiny little voices, almost lost in the clamour. But ultimately, I think everybody knows that something has to change over there. The way a spokesman for a very small farming organisation over there, the United Farmers Association, once put it was, Ireland is too small and too precious to deny access to anyone. And he was speaking on behalf of very small, marginal hill farmers, which are basically the ones you would come across if you were going climbing mountains. And I think one of the riders he put in there was, but would you ever just stop and talk to us when you come past the property, because we're going half mad with loneliness up there, which I thought was very sad. But, you can see just passing the time of day with someone can make all the difference. Giving them a scowl and just stomping by, well, that looks bad anywhere in the world, I think. So there is, room for plenty of movement there, and I would hope that the next few years we'll see some of the problems being resolved.
Oh, great. So a good mountain holiday, good strenuous walking. You need to know what you're doing. You really need to be comfortable navigating. But every evening there's that wonderful welcome somewhere in a village or a town nearby, and great traditional Irish hospitality. It's certainly a good way of spending a summer, I think. Now, the Coastal Path book is the last one that I bought, just looking at it, and that's fascinating as well, because we tend to think here about the Southwest Coastal Path and the Pembrokeshire Way and whatever, but Ireland, of course, if you just think about it, must have stunning coastal walks, and it certainly seems to do so from the book.
Yeah, I think the coastline is something around 4,000 or 5,000 miles, and while you couldn't, really get the proper access to be able to walk right next to the sea all the way around, there are plenty of places, especially in the west, where it's all battered, shattered headlands, if you like, poking into the Atlantic. Plenty of places where you can pick off some really, really excellent coastal walks. I mean, some of the best I've ever seen anywhere in the world, and hardly anybody knows about them. I started with a plan to just work my way around the coast and pick off anything that looked nice and interesting. But as I got out the west, originally everything was going to be on the Irish mainland, but I was so fascinated by the islands that I ended up including 19 walks on the islands. They're just so amazing, and some of them don't actually have anyone living on them permanently. Others have settled communities on them, thriving communities, but just the logistics of getting to them, figuring out all these little ferries to get out there, I just couldn't help but include them. So in the end, I ended up with over 50 walks, plucked off the coastline, of which 19 of them were on islands, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I went through every type of weather out there, and I have to say, say I must be something of a stormcock, because when the wind is really blowing and mountainous seas are crashing into rocky headlands, that's, I think, when I'm happiest out on a coastal walk. I find a beach walk is all very well, but a proper walk on a headland in a storm, that suits me down to the ground. But the ferry rides to the islands in a storm can be really quite a nightmare. But I thoroughly enjoyed putting those routes together, because it got me into some of the most, extreme situations right out on the end of headlands.
Yes, anybody planning to walk the coastal paths should allow time to visit the islands. I mean, they're fantastic, and also some of the history associated with them is both fascinating and very sad in many ways. I mean, places like the Blasket Islands are just absolutely wonderful, steeped in history, steeped in tradition, and certainly a worthwhile taking. Don't miss them, I think, is the message there. And as we move into the north, the coastal path is, I guess, even less well exploited.
Well, there are some places, as you go in, say, around Donegal, there's some very, very bleak and remote headlands there, very rocky ones, but every single point seems to have a road going towards it, so it's easy enough to step off the road, get round the headland and back again. But Northern Ireland, they've actually, the National Trust is active there, and they've then built up big stretches of the Antrim coast and made sure that there's a continuous coastal path there. And I think one of the most fascinating and varied stretches of coastline anywhere in Ireland must be along the causeway. Everybody knows the strange hexagonal columns that are all piled up at the Giant's Causeway. What they don't realise is there's about another 20 miles of really good coastal walking there, quite apart from the bit where you just stroll down from the visitor centre and back again in a quarter of an hour. You get sandy beaches, big chalk cliffs, big basalt cliffs, places where you're hopping from boulder to boulder, even walking through archways that have been punched into the cliffs by the sea. And then the tiny little fishing harbours and places along the way. It's a fascinating coastline, and it's just strange that everybody just goes to see the Giant's Causeway. They don't actually explore the rest of the Causeway coast. But even Belfast has a fantastic little coastal walk, the North Down coastal path, which you could follow for about 10 miles or so on the southern shore of Belfast Lough, and you're looking across the loch towards the big built-up parts of Belfast, and yet you're walking this lovely green trail, if you like, and around tiny little headlands. There's plenty to be going on with it, just around the coast there. And I find I was having to make several visits to pull all these routes together. But certainly the Causeway coast of Northern Ireland is one of the best coasts going. If you want the most remote coastal walk, and probably the toughest one, that will be the North Mayo coast, but hardly anyone ever gets there. I think it was one of the last places to be visited by relief workers after the potato famine, and they were just amazed at the journey they had to put in just to reach that coast. I think the only access was really from the sea, so the first thing they did in that area was build roads in there. It doesn't seem to have changed much. You drive along these roads across bogs for miles, and then you start your coastal walk, and it's literally like being on a huge great roller coaster, up and down, big hills dropping into the sea, big cliffs cut out of them. Truly wonderful, but hardly anyone knows where it is or even how to find it. So again, having put in the blood, sweat and tears myself, I've figured out how you cope with a route like that, and then tell the readers how they can cope with it, and it certainly makes their life easier than mine going out there looking for it in the first place.
Yeah, I was walking in the North Mayo, and I found it just like you. You'd drive for an hour or so from Westport, and then you'd suddenly be into the most bleak and lonely but wonderful landscape. There's no doubt about that. So that's Coastal Walks, and that's also published by Cicerone. And so Ireland, Paddy, seems to have something for everyone in walking, really. There's long-distance footpaths, mountains, and the coastal paths as well. If you were looking to to plan a first 2 weeks there for the first time, where would you head off towards?
Well, I think what happens with a place like Ireland is people go with preconceptions. So you'll almost certainly find the vast bulk of people will say, oh, let's go to Kerry because we've heard of Kerry and everyone else has heard of Kerry, and that's where the biggest mountain is. And by and large, you won't go wrong doing that. You know, I mean, if you want to go down to Kerry, climb the highest mountain, walk a long-distance route, enjoy the coast, it's all there. But it's all there in Dublin as well. You can climb 3,000-foot mountain just on the in the Wicklow Mountains. You can walk the long-distance Wicklow Way. You can explore the coast between Greystones and Braehead. And it doesn't really matter where you stick your pin in around the edge of Ireland. You're going to find a long-distance trail, some big mountains, and some exceptional coast. But generally, the further west you go, the better. I'd always say, you know, head west, young man, if you like. It's that sort of a place. But if you do end up, say, on a trip, maybe, you know, go to somebody's party in Dublin or something like that, do take the time to explore the Wicklow Mountains. And if you don't even have that much time, at least walk around the coastline of Hove Head. It takes you about 3 hours, you know, and that's better than nothing. So it really doesn't matter where you land. We do need easy access of a lot of varied countryside. And it's literally, you know, the sort of countryside that if you can cope with it in Britain, you can cope with the same type of terrain in Ireland. You just need to be a bit more with your wits about you, and you won't get the helpful public footpath signs or anything like that. You have to do a lot of, you know, map work and guesswork, you know, and that's where, say, you know, handy guidebook comes in very useful, because it takes a lot of that guesswork out of it. Actually tells you what you need to know. But yeah, anything goes really in Ireland. If anyone gets the opportunity to go there, I'd just say, yeah, head anywhere. But if you're going to say do what people often do, then yes, head to the southwest, head to Kerry. It's as good a place as any to start, but it's by no means the last word in walking in Ireland.
So great days out, and always that wonderful hospitality at the end of the day, and some of the most fantastic B&Bs you'll ever come across, really. I think, you know, if you can't, you could probably survive for a week on one of those breakfasts. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things they have to get around is the big, full, greasy fry. Some people love them, some people really can't cope with them, but that tends to be standard fare over there, and every single B&B is doing them.
After 7 or 8 days of that, you're just desperate for a bowl of muesli, aren't you? So
That's right.
It's amazing. Now, we can't leave a discussion about Ireland without talking a bit about the weather.
Yes, well, it's very, very close to the Atlantic, and that's where all our weather comes from, and it's coming day after day after day. I think there are something like 100 depressions a year tracked somewhere along, you know, passing by Ireland, and most of them, they're coming off the Atlantic, they're rolling across Ireland, and there'll be a big front comes in, everything goes grey, drizzly, misty. If you're up the mountains, it's going to be misty, and it's going to rain. If you're down in the lowlands, it probably rain a bit, but it won't be that misty. So what you've got to try and do is just play it around the weather. They're very good with their weather forecast. They deliver them with a smile even when they're absolutely appalling. Listen to the weather forecast, find out what it's going to be for the next day, and if you're going to get a good day, do something special with it. And if it's going to be a truly lousy day, find something else. I mean, if it's pouring with rain, I always say go and look at waterfalls. There's plenty of them. If it's going to be a storm, like I say, I like nothing better than being on those battered western headlands when the sea comes piling into the cliffs. Make the most of the weather. Don't let the weather dictate, you know, whether you go out at all or not. Actually make the most of the weather. So for the wet days, go looking at water features. And on the really good clear days, make sure you're up on some big mountain range somewhere and putting in some distance while you're at it, because it may not be like that again the next day. No, it does vary a lot. What you tend to find is, you know, the winters are milder than in Britain, the summers are cooler than in Britain. So overall, there isn't a huge big difference between summer and winter as there would be, say, in mainland Britain. So you're not going to get that much snow or that much frost, but you're not going to get a great big heat wave either. What you're going to get is a lot of mixed weather right through the year.
So take your waterproofs, but you will get good days. If you are a 2-week holiday, you will get, in the summer, you will get some good days. I wouldn't like everybody to think they're going to spend all of their time soaked to the skin. It's not going to happen, I don't think. Paddy, that's been fantastic. I think it would be a shame if people went through their walking careers, as it were, walking in the lakes in Scotland and never sampling Ireland at all. Yeah,
it tends to take people a long time to discover Ireland, but once they've discovered it, it's never just a single journey to Ireland and that's it for the rest of their life. People who go to Ireland once become return visitors. There's no doubt about it. I don't think anybody goes there once and says never ever again. They go there once and that's the beginning of a big long series of trips. So I've always found that it can take people almost their entire lives to get round to going to Ireland. After they've visited everywhere else in the world, they suddenly in their twilight years discover Ireland and then decide one visit just isn't enough. And believe me, some people go over there in a car to drive around. They think it's a little blob in the sea and they can drive around it in a week and see everything. Absolutely not. No way. It's taken me nearly 30 years just to scratch the surface. I mean, I've churned out about nearly a dozen guidebooks, 3 for Cicerone there, and even after 30 years, I can go there and I'll still discover new things in places that I already know very well. So once people go for the first time, believe me, they go back for a second, a third. They become repeat visitors in no time at all.
Well, I don't think there could be a better advocate for walking in Ireland than you, Paddy. Thanks very much. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, that just about wraps up another podcast. Thanks again to Paddy Dillon. We were talking about his 3 major guides to walking in Ireland: a guide to mountain walking, the Coastal Path Guide, and the Coast to Coast Trail Guide. All of them published by Cicerone, and they retail in about the £13 to £15 mark. We hope to be talking to Paddy again shortly about Corsica and some of the other exotic islands in the Mediterranean, to which he disappears when the weather starts getting a bit cold and damp here. Thanks again, as always, to Bob and Rose Cartwright at the Outdoors channel, without whom these podcasts would not be possible. I'm Andy Howell, and until next time, take care and happy hiking.
My thanks go to Andy once again for making the book club what it is and go from strength to strength with some really interesting interviews. There'll be much more from him very soon. Until then, this is Bob Cartwright at theoutdoorstation.co.uk. The new name, theoutdoorstation.co.uk, beavering away in the background and trying to keep it all together.